Claire Curran.
Mr Speaker, it's nice to have the member opposite being a bit philosophical about things. It's just a pity that she's been rewriting history throughout the few minutes that she stood up, because as she well knows, and as the rest of the members of this House know, that Labor supports this bill because it's essentially a Labor bill. And it's nice to hear that that Amy Adams thinks that regulation is important, albeit only sometimes, and that regulatory reform and improvement is also important. And as has been pointed out earlier, this omnibus bill is an outcome of a quality regulation review which was led by the Honourable Leanne Dalzell when she was the Minister of Commerce. It's not an idea that came out of the brain of the Honourable Rodney Hyde. She introduced that first regulatory improvement bill that I've spoken on in this House last year, which was an omnibus bill as well, and was passed by that government across the way, who then took the credit for it. And at the time, Rodney Hyde said that the government would commit to an annual bill of this nature, and that's what we have here today. But instead of calling it the Regulatory Improvement Bill number 2, he's now calling it the Regulatory Reform Bill and taking the credit for the concept as well as the content. And I just want to put on the record that the concept was and remains a Labor initiative. And as I said before, the bill was the result of a quality regulation review. That report was released in September 2008 after a 15-month review process, and the quality regulation review addressed the regulatory barriers to business growth, which Labor was absolutely committed to looking into and to improving upon. It was a broad review. It looked at the anomalies, inconsistencies and duplication across the government's regulatory framework. And as well as correcting some errors, the review aimed to develop ways of ensuring new rules were efficient from a business perspective. Around that time, Labor also launched a 2-year trial of a business cost calculator in order to quantify the compliance costs of regulation, and that was a really important new initiative. It was a 2-year trial. And that calculator was a software tool that allowed government officials to calculate the true costs for businesses of any regulations that they were recommending to government. And the tool was designed to assist policymakers create a higher quality regulation in a uniform and efficient manner, which are all the principles that underpinned that quality regulation review. And at the time that it was launched under the previous Labor government, Business New Zealand Chief Executive Phil O'Reilly said that it would help sharpen the focus on what costs business to comply with new regulation. And those costs include fees for consents, payment for signs, manual software or professional fees, and staff time to perform those functions. All good practice and all things that the previous Labor government was committed to doing. Mr Speaker, annual regulatory improvement bills are a sensible way of ensuring quality regulation, but while those changes may be helpful to some business, most of the changes in this bill are, as Chapman Tripp has said, small and technical in nature, hardly slashing red tape, as Rodney Hyde announced in December. And in an article on their website titled "Red Tape Slashed by Regulatory Reform Bill" or snipped, came from the 22nd of December last year. Chapman Tripp wrote, quote, "The regulatory reform bill will slash red tape," according to its sponsor Rodney Hyde, and indeed the bill will remove a lot of unnecessary bureaucratic clutter. But almost by definition, most of the changes, while useful, are small and technical in nature, they said. And then they said, in our view, more substantial amendments to the Companies Act 1993 is required to fix long-standing technical gaps and to catch up with the modernisation of company law in other countries, unquote. Chapman Tripp thought that sounded more like a snip than a slash. So there's that argument. And another argument is that we question whether this is going to lead to quantifiable growth in the economy, and doesn't the government have anything better to do? And also, as my colleague, the Honourable Leanne Dalzell has said, why isn't there more in it? Let's just have a quick look at the summary of changes. It's going to amend the Companies Act to allow companies to choose whether to use electronic shareholder participation. It'll amend the Unit Trusts Act 1960, so financial statements and accounts can be distributed electronically, which will result in cost savings to unit trusts. It'll also amend the Films, Videos and Publications Classification Act to modernise labelling, which has been estimated to reduce compliance costs by $2.4 million in the first year and $3 million in year 5. And also it'll align and make consistent in all food-related legislations. We don't have any issues with any of this because we were the ones who initiated it. But I do want to talk briefly about the electronic documentation, voting and meeting participation aspect of it, because those changes were sought by the Listed Companies Association in 2009 and have been more recently endorsed by the New Zealand Shareholders Association. Those changes will reduce compliance costs and bring New Zealand into line with other jurisdictions. The Listed Companies Association estimated that, not the Minister, estimated that aggregate cost savings of around $1.5 million a year could be generated among listed companies, assuming a 30% uptake of electronic voting facilities and use of those facilities for one voting process per shareholder per year. And this again builds on the previous work of the previous Labor government, done by previous Commerce Minister Paul Swain in 2005, where he noted that an information revolution was taking place and that technological and innovative capability of New Zealand businesses and citizens would be the key to ensuring our ability to compete in world markets and our enthusiasm and capacity to exploit the opportunities offered by the 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week global economy. And this measure is building on this. And it sounded in the previous speech as if somehow this was all a new idea and a new initiative and that somehow the national government had come up with it all itself. We support it, as we've said, but I do want to note two concerns. Firstly, I want to echo what the Honourable Leanne Dalzell said about the removal of the regulatory impact statements from the bills. Requiring people to look at the proposed legislation who are looking for legislation to go to another ministry, department, website to find it is not open and transparent government. It's government that's wanting to obfuscate and remove any potential criticism of their legislation from public scrutiny. Yes, you can still get the regulatory impact statement, but if you don't understand the process works or know where to look for it, then you won't find it. And I want to put on record my concern about that. Secondly, there are concerns about aspects, and as my previous colleague has talked about the proposed amendments to the Takeovers Act, and we will be looking closely at that when it gets to the Select Committee. I note the issues raised by the reporter Adam Bennett in this morning's New Zealand Herald. In a piece titled "Planned Friendly Amendment to Takeovers Act Sparks Worry," where essentially the concern was raised that as the government seeks to sell the public on state asset sales, it's amending a key protection for small investors, which it is feared may allow company takeovers to go ahead in order to maintain friendly relations with other countries. This is a serious concern, and this essentially enables the Takeovers Panel to take into consideration something called international comity or friendliness between nations. And the panel that administers the Takeover Code can issue exemptions for companies looking to take over another business where it believes they're warranted. Now, a company's law expert and the Shareholders Association have expressed a lot of concern about this. We think this is an important issue in relation to the ability of foreign investors to take controlling stakes in local assets, and note that we will be looking closely at it in the Select Committee. We support this bill primarily because it builds on the work done by the previous Labor government. It will remove duplicating and overlapping regulatory requirements. It will design safe harbours, and it will allow more rigorous risk analysis when developing and enforcing law, and provide tailored information on regulatory requirements to meet the needs of business. And I look forward to it coming to the Select Committee.